I've written two pieces this week specifically on the fact that it's here, it's now, and as we leave 2025, the number one most important thing for people is this year was a transition year where inference started to accelerate in terms of token usage, which leads us into the next stage of artificial intelligence, which I've called stage two, where stage one was where these machines and these bots went through undergrad and they've graduated. They have 160 IQ now, and that number is only going to continue to compound every month and as every release comes out. But that just means we're closer and closer to knowledge workers being disrupted, and knowledge workers make up a huge percentage of obviously the United States labor, and that's going to start in much bigger fold this year. And the problem is you've already seen Walmart. Now you've seen Amazon make the headlines. You've seen Accenture. Three of the four biggest private employers in the country have all said, we're not going to be hiring.
The international economy is entering a phase of the cycle that is among the most widely misconstrued. Central banks are reducing interest rates. Liquidity is gradually reestablishing itself. Nevertheless, the world continues to anticipate suffering rather than progress. But what if the situation has reversed this time? What if we are approaching one of those infrequent macro periods where declining interest rates and increasing growth converge, establishing an optimal environment for risk assets across the board? That is the central theme underpinning a recent Real Vision discussion between Raoul and Jordi Visser, the founder and chief strategist at Visser Labs, two of the most astute analysts monitoring global liquidity and exponential innovation. Visser contends that although markets have been preoccupied with concerns over China tariffs and economic stagnation, the subsequent phase is already being shaped by AI-driven productivity, increased infrastructure investment, and a surge of new liquidity entering the system. The Federal Reserve's shift signifies only the initial phase. As rate reductions propagate through international markets, accumulated capital expenditures and debt refinancing will generate new liquidity throughout the economy. According to both Paul and Visser, investors are not prepared for what lies ahead, an environment in which economic growth intensifies despite ongoing declines in interest rates. That combination is uncommon, nonetheless potent, and it consistently establishes a foundation for a significant increase in asset prices. And indeed, this encompasses Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency assets, as in a liquidity-driven environment, the same dynamics that inflate equity and real estate valuations also propelled the subsequent phase of the digital assets cycle. In this video, we will analyze in detail the perspectives of Raoul and Jordi Visser regarding upcoming developments, their reasoning behind the potential onset of a significant new liquidity cycle in 2025, and how this cycle may transform markets in unforeseen ways. Before we proceed, please ensure you like this video, subscribe if you have not done so already, and activate notifications to receive further incisive analyses from some of the industry's leading experts. Thank you, and please enjoy the video.
Let's say pivots towards worrying about labor, and that happens in August at Jackson Hole, and you get all the cries from people that are worried about inflation and the cries from people that believe the Fed is making a policy mistake. And I think you and I are both, in this point of that eventually labor is going to be disrupted by exponential innovation. And I've written two pieces this week specifically on the fact that it's here, it's now, and as we leave 2025, the number one most important thing for people is this year was a transition year where inference started to accelerate in terms of token usage, which leads us into the next stage of artificial intelligence, which I've called stage two, where stage one was where these machines and these bots went through undergrad and they've graduated. They have 160 IQ now, and that number is only going to continue to compound every month and as every release comes out. But that just means we're closer and closer to knowledge workers being disrupted, and knowledge workers make up a huge percentage of obviously the United States labor, and that's going to start in much bigger fold this year. And the problem is you've already seen Walmart. Now you've seen Amazon make the headlines. You've seen Accenture. three of the four biggest private employers in the country, have all said, we're not going to be hiring. We'll hire eventually, but they've openly said that they're not hiring. And I'll just bring this up because I highlighted this chart last week, which is if you have a long-term chart of earnings per share and you overlay it with two separate labor indicators, one just temp employees hired. Temps have been going down consistently now, really since 2022. Exactly right around the point that ChatGPT got launched. And then secondly is just the JOLTS number, which obviously went up dramatically during COVID, but has come back down. But those two things were very, very much correlated almost exactly to earnings per share in the S&P. So we've entered that very dangerous point where, especially from the big companies like Amazon who are spending lots of money, they need to be reducing employees to stay competitive. And I think one of the mistakes people have made is that they actually believe, number one, AI is not going to do that. That's a mistake. Well, you and I both know that. Number two, they kind of view it as, well, the companies are not going to fire the people. And the reality is, in a capitalist world where your shareholders determine and your board determines what you're doing, you are absolutely going to see profit margins be the way that people are going to focus on. And I think we're at that inflection point right now where this labor situation, which has reached levels unprecedented, where you could have nominal GDP growing at 5% and no creation of jobs outside of healthcare, we're already seeing it. And I just don't think enough people that I'm speaking with recognize how quickly this has come on and how we're at the very beginning stages of something that goes exponential in terms of the labor side. And how do you catch up to exponential? So this is never going to get better on the labor side. It's only going to either stay the same or worsen. And I think that has huge implications. And that's what I've been writing about lately.
So does that mean that unemployment rises or we just stop employing people as GDP grows?
Well, see, this is an interesting question. This is the way I've been framing it for people lately, because you and I both know that, I mean, one of the charts that you highlight a lot is the labor force participation rate. Okay, well, the labor force participation rate I've redefined as the rate of people who need to work. Because you end up in a situation where there's two things that can make people not need to work. One is they're fully on transfer payments, which means they're getting money from the government. They're getting subsidies. They're getting the transfer payments, which have been built up in Social Security and everything else. Or they've made enough money because they've had enough money in stocks. But either way, it's a need to work thing. So you've had a lot of people leave the labor force. And I think
or it's an age thing, right? If you're in your 80s, you're unemployable.
Yes. And I think to a degree, I'm including a lot of the older people in the side of receiving pensions or receiving something like that. But you're right. There's an inability to be in which the demographics keep worsening. And I know you guys highlight the demographic side. For me, the reason this is important is because even just since May, the labor participation rate, I think, is down 0.5.
Visser initiates the discussion with the labor market, which he refers to as the silent disruption. He articulates that the rapid and exponential growth of artificial intelligence and automation is already transforming the workforce, beginning with knowledge-based occupations. Major employers such as Walmart, Amazon, and Accenture have all suspended recruiting, indicating the initial phase of what Visser characterizes as the decoupling of growth and employment. In other words, gross domestic product may continue to increase even if employment growth stagnates. Raoul concurs, emphasizing that this transition signifies a fundamental transformation in the functioning of the economy. Corporate profits can increase without the need for additional employment, leading to improved profit margins and potentially elevated equity valuations. However, this also implies that inequality will increase, thereby intensifying the pressure on policymakers to employ both fiscal and monetary measures. This is where macroeconomic analysis intersects with the financial markets. Fewer employees, enhanced profitability, and an economy progressively sustained by liquidity and innovation rather than extensive labor growth. This leads us to the subsequent significant query. If economic growth persists robustly while inflation diminishes, how will the Federal Reserve and other central banks respond?
We'd be at a point where the unemployment rate would be closer to 5 right now if the labor if the labor force hadn't shrunk. And so the problem is, as the labor force participation rate goes down, we'd be closer to 8% unemployment if we didn't have it fall so much since the great financial crisis. And I think
this
that's
also to do with immigration as well?
Well, immigration theoretically should be reducing the supply of labor. And this is kind of my big issue, is when people talk about the fact that immigration is becoming an issue for the hiring numbers, that's all well and good. But then why would the Conference Board differential be worsening so much, saying that the anxiety for workers is that they won't be able to get a job? So that doesn't match up with the surveys. And then people can say, well, that's Trump related. That's whatever. The reality is, it's the hiring market has absolutely worsened. And that's why I bring up Accenture, I bring up Walmart, I bring up Amazon, because Amazon has the same amount of employees as it did in 2022. So they're about to reduce again. The issue is, if you look back at their employees and the growth they had from 2007 up until now, it was a linear line. I mean, it was literally like it just went up by nominal GDP every year, and now it's not growing anymore. So we've broken the connection where as GDP goes up, we don't need to hire any people. And you and I have talked about this before, but I think one of the big macro mistakes that's happened that has led to people not understanding why we don't have recessions anymore. Yes, the Fed has these liquidity facilities, but the other thing is we just saw 7 companies go from $1.5 trillion to 15 trillion, 16 trillion, 17 trillion, 18 trillion in market cap. And they took no debt to do that. That has never happened before in the history of mankind with capitalism. So you had a breakdown in those relationships of nominal GDP versus debt. Well, now you're having a breakdown in nominal GDP versus people. They both have to do with software, and they both have to do. Software was already doing this, Raoul, is really my point. We just didn't call it the same thing as what's happening with AI, because AI is a more dangerous thing.
Yeah, and it's hyperscaling.
Yes.
The speed of the acceleration of this. So what does that mean, before we dig in more into the AI side, what does it mean for the economy? It puts the Fed reaction function towards cutting more? Or do they realize what the problem is? And it's like, well, this is not a stimulus-based thing. Is it a fiscal thing that ends up happening? What is the outcome of this? Because growth is not going to slow.
So unfortunately, if you go back to let's use the K-shaped economy, we know the bottom end of the K is very dependent on interest rates by definition. So whether it's commercial real estate, whether it's real estate itself, whether it's auto sales, or whether it's individuals, they depend on the fiat system, which is credit based. They need to borrow money to go through this, where the things on the top end, wealthy people, the Mag 7, they don't care about interest rates. In fact, the higher interest rates go, the more they benefit from it. So I think what it's done, and I think what has happened, is this still becomes a relationship between the dual mandate. And the reason that I think it makes sense for the Fed to be cutting is that everyone's fears about inflation were wrong. And there's just no other way to say it. I mean, the tariff numbers are as high as what people were worried about back in April, and yet we're not getting the inflation that everyone thought feeding through. And that's because, as you and I both know, I mean, AI is an incredibly deflationary force.
The most deflationary thing that could ever exist.
Yeah. So again, if you're going to hit labor, and wages on every metric have gone lower since the peak in 2021, 2022. I just don't see how they're going to be able to do anything other than cut rates. Now, the administration, and this is something that I don't hear people talk enough about, this White House is filled with AI people in it all the time. And you don't have to believe in everything about AI, meaning I'm not an AGI person, meaning I don't believe in the concept that there's this magical thing that just kicks in and there's one winner and everybody loses. I do believe in artificial and general intelligence. I do believe in it being deflationary, but they've put the boogeyman in both the White House. China's worried about it because from a military perspective, but honestly, Demis Hassabis does not want to rule the world. I mean, he seems like a really nice guy who just won the Nobel Prize. And when he talks about things, he talks about people living forever and him being able to be a part of that. I think Elon Musk cares about putting people on Mars. I don't think he's into making more trillions of dollars. They're not driven by this thing. I mean, they're gamers. They're nerds. They're people that are trying to do stuff. So I think when in the context of the way Wall Street looks at this stuff, they're still focused on the monetary policy side, where I think monetary and fiscal are going to be aligned, which is we have an inequality situation, which is only going to worsen. And the more deflationary it is, the worse the situation gets. And so I think their job job is going to be to help people, especially when we go into a midterms. The one big beautiful bill was structured in a way that the ramp up of everything is going to happen as we get into the first half of next year, leading into that. So for everyone who's out there wondering what the economy is going to look like, the Fed's cutting rates, global central banks around the world have been cutting rates. And the PMI hasn't started to rise yet. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fears over China and the fears over the whole tariff situation. I think everything is going to go higher because of all the spending in CapEx, all the pent up stuff from the one big beautiful bill, and all the rate cuts, which we know is a leading indicator for all of the things that'll go higher. And so I don't think people are ready for a situation where the economy is going to be growing at the same time that rates are coming down.
Yeah, I get the same read of this. And the other thing is the ongoing refinancing of the debt means the ongoing liquidity. We're seeing China printing money. All of that whole game, the everything code game, is still at play. One of the things that's happening right now is the government shutdown, which means that the Treasury can't spend the Treasury general account, which is actually the only straightforward liquidity mechanism they've got because they aren't using the balance sheet and the reverse repos drain. So the moment the government shutdown opens up,
as the discussion progressed, both Raoul and Jordi Visser arrived at the same conclusion. The forthcoming policy response is no longer focused on combating inflation. It pertains to the administration of liquidity. Visser anticipates that the Federal Reserve will continue lowering interest rates, with other global central banks mirroring these actions, and that new expenditure initiatives will further increase liquidity within the system. Raoul states that even in the absence of formal quantitative easing, the combination of Treasury expenditures, diminished quantitative tightening, and forthcoming regulatory modifications will yield the same result: increased capital flowing through financial markets. And this marks the point at which the narrative becomes exceptionally optimistic for investors. Because when liquidity increases while growth remains steady, it functions as a catalyst for risk assets, particularly those influenced by narrative and network effects. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other cryptocurrency assets flourish under these very conditions: declining real yields, increasing liquidity, and expanding institutional confidence. We have already observed initial indications of this transition. The government closure temporarily suspended Treasury expenditures. However, upon reopening, liquidity injections will recommence. China is engaging in further printing activities. Global liquidity indicators are showing an upward trend, and upon examining history, each significant increase in cryptocurrency valuations originated during instances similar to this, when policymakers injected substantial liquidity into the system to sustain economic growth. Whether monitoring equities, gold, or cryptocurrencies, the message from Powell and Visser remains unequivocal. Liquidity underpins all activities, and if their assessment proves accurate, the upcoming months may signify the onset of a robust, synchronized upward trend across global assets, with Bitcoin once more emerging as the primary indicator of future capital movements. Do you consider that the next significant development in the cryptocurrency market has already commenced? If you found this analysis informative, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts on Raoul and Jordi's perspective on liquidity and growth in the comments. Thank you for your viewing. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.